Ever find yourself reading a research paper and you're just like, wait a minute, how did this actually get through? Like the ethics review board.
Yeah.
Well, get ready, because today's deep dive, it's all about asking those important questions, the right questions about research ethics.
Yes.
We're diving deep into a chapter from Ethics for Behavior Analysts.
Great book.
Specifically, we're tackling the chapter that focuses on research ethics.
Yeah, a very important chapter for sure.
Think of this deep dive as like your cheat sheet, right? Your guide to navigating kind of the wild world of ethical behavior analysis research.
Yeah, and I think what's often overlooked is that, we think about ethics a lot in terms of direct client care, right?
Right.
But research really has its own set of ethical considerations and responsibilities. And Dr. Zane really kind of digs deep into those.
He does, and he does it in a really smart way, I think, because he uses these really compelling case studies.
Yes.
Like, these are situations that you could totally see happening.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
In a research setting.
Right.
And so it's not just, kind of these abstract principles. It's like seeing how they actually play out in these real-world scenarios.
Yeah, and I think those case studies are so important because you really see the potential implications, if you don't follow those ethical guidelines.
Yeah.
Like, they can be huge,
Absolutely.
And so, like, one of the things that Dr. Zane talks about that's really important is, like, understanding all the different levels of ethical oversight.
Okay.
So it's not just, your IRB, your institutional review board.
Right.
There might be like agency guidelines, state regulations, federal laws, so like it can be really complex.
So it's not just about like, okay, I got the IRB approval, like I'm good to go.
Exactly.
Okay, yeah.
And he actually has this great case study. I think it's called like cease and desist, where this BCBA thinks they're good to go. They got IRB approval and they start recruiting participants for their study.
Okay.
But they forgot about their agency's own review process.
Oh.
They didn't realize that they needed to get that separate approval as well.
Oh, wow.
And so it's just this good reminder that, like, each of these layers of oversight, they all exist for a reason.
Right.
They're all there to protect those research participants.
Yeah, right. You think you're in the clear, and then you realize, wait a minute, there's like another door I got to go knock on.
Exactly.
Okay, interesting. And, speaking of protecting participants, I thought it was really interesting how Dr. Zane, he doesn't just focus on kind of the obvious, like, physical harm.
Right.
Right? He also talks about the potential for psychological harm.
Yes, so important and often a lot more nuanced.
It is.
Think back to, like, the Tuskegee syphilis study.
Oh, yeah.
That's like a very, very stark reminder of what can happen when you don't consider those ethical implications.
Oh, a chilling example for sure.
Right. And what Dr. Zane points out is that even research activities that seem harmless on the surface can actually have these unintended consequences. Oh, interesting.
He gives this example of a researcher who wants to interview adults about their experiences as children of divorce.
Okay, yeah.
Sounds pretty straightforward.
It does.
Right. But the IRB actually flagged that because even though it's, years later, revisiting those experiences as an adult could actually be really emotionally distressing for some people.
Interesting.
And so it's called the IRB protection case study. And it just highlights how, as researchers, we have to be so thoughtful and consider all these potential risks, even if they're not immediately obvious.
Yeah, like proactively asking those what-if questions.
Exactly.
Okay, that's interesting. So we're thinking about kind of multiple layers of responsibility, right?
Right.
Protecting participants from various forms of harm. What else?
Yeah, so Dr. Zane, he dives into this really tricky area, which is when you have research and clinical service delivery kind of intersecting.
Ooh, interesting.
Because in the field of behavior analysis, that happens a lot, right?
Right.
Where you might be working with clients and also doing research.
And so it's this balancing act.
Right. How do you make sure that one doesn't overshadow the other?
Exactly.
He talks about this case, is it called Time is of the Essence?
Yes.
Where
it's about transparency, really.
It is.
With parents or caregivers about how much time their child is actually spending participating in research activities versus, working on their actual clinical goals, right?
So it's not just about the participants' well-being, but it's also about making sure that the research aligns with their overall treatment goals as well.
Absolutely, yeah.
Interesting.
It requires a lot of communication and collaboration.
It does.
Between the researchers and the clinicians.
Yeah.
To make sure that everybody's on the same page.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's a team effort.
It is.
For sure. Now, speaking of making sure that everyone's on the same page and things are clear and understood.
Yes.
We got to talk about informed consent. right?
Yes,
Like
absolutely.
that's a big one.
It is.
It's interesting because you think of informed consent and just assume like, oh, it's about getting someone to sign a form,
Right.
like check the box.
Yeah.
But it's so much more than that.
It is. It is.
Dr. Zane really breaks it down into like those essential elements of what truly makes informed consent.
Yeah. Information, capacity, voluntariness.
Yes. It's about ensuring that like the participant really gets what they're signing up for,
Yeah.
that they're actually capable of making that decision
Right.
and that they're not being pressured in any way.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's a huge responsibility.
It is.
That falls on the researcher.
For sure.
You can't just like throw a bunch of technical jargon at someone
Yeah.
and be like, here, sign this.
Right.
You have to make sure the information is presented in a way that's clear, that's understandable.
Totally. And I think there's like, even if someone's legally an adult,
Right.
that doesn't necessarily mean that they have the capacity
Exactly.
to consent.
Right. There could be other factors at play. Absolutely.
Right. So it's really about kind of making sure everyone understands what it is they're agreeing to.
Yeah, for sure. And, kind of along those same lines of protecting participants.
Yeah.
Dr. Zane also talks about confidentiality, which is a big one.
Which feels like such a minefield these days, right?
Oh, absolutely, especially in the digital age.
Right. It's not just about like keeping names under wraps anymore.
Right.
It's like we leave these digital footprints everywhere we go,
Exactly. And it can be really hard to kind of think about all those different ways that someone's identity could be compromised.
Right. And Dr. Zane gives that example of, what was it called? Imperfect confidentiality or something.
An imperfect confidentiality, yeah.
Where like, even though the researcher thought they had like de-identified everything,
right,
they still wound up accidentally revealing, kind of identifying information during a presentation.
Yeah, just goes to show it's so easy to overlook things.
It is.
That seem really insignificant, but could actually compromise someone's privacy.
Yeah, good reminder to be extra cautious in this digital world.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we've talked about kind of informed consent, confidentiality.
Right.
What about like the researchers themselves?
Yeah.
Like what makes someone qualified to actually lead a research project in the first place?
Yeah, that's where demonstrable competence comes in.
Okay.
It's not enough to just have good intentions. You really need the knowledge,
Yeah.
the skills,
Yeah.
and the experience to
Right.
navigate all these complexities.
Totally.
And so, Dr. Zane uses this case study, I think it's called, like research ineptness,
Okay.
where this well-intentioned BCBA, they want to do a classroom management study,
Okay. Yeah.
but they make a number of missteps along the way because they just overestimated their competence.
Interesting. So it's more than just being like good at, research methods or like data analysis and stuff.
Right.
It's like you have to understand the ethics as well.
Exactly.
And I imagine that like if you're not competent in the ethics,
Oh, yeah.
that probably like undermines the validity of the research itself too, right?
Well, and
Because it's all connected.
yeah, ethical research and rigorous research, they go hand in hand.
They do.
And, that kind of leads into another really important aspect that Dr. Zane emphasizes, which is conflicts of interest.
Oh, yeah. And we're not just talking about like, suitcases full of cash here.
Right. No. Although that would be a problem.
Yeah.
But it can be a lot more subtle than that.
Okay.
Right. Like Dr. Zane talks about financial conflicts, obviously. Like if you have undisclosed ties to a company,
Right.
that's funding your research.
Right.
But it can also be personal conflicts, professional conflicts.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Right. Just anything that could potentially influence the way that you're, designing your study,
Yeah.
collecting your data, interpreting your data, presenting your data.
Yeah. Great. Even subconsciously.
Right. It could be totally subconscious.
Right.
Like you don't even realize it.
Exactly. And so like he talks about this case,
Yeah.
undisclosed, where these researchers working on this technology, and they don't mention that they also have this affiliation with the company that's funding the research.
Right. And it's like, even if their findings were completely objective,
Right.
that lack of transparency, like it just casts a shadow over the entire project.
It erodes trust.
It does.
Right.
Yeah.
Like, why didn't you just disclose that?
Yeah.
What are you trying to hide?
Right. Exactly.
It's really, really important.
So transparency is key.
Transparency is key. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Just being upfront about anything that could even
Right.
potentially influence the research.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Now, in a similar vein, Dr. Zane also talks about the importance of giving credit where credit is due.
Yes.
Right. So like authorship, acknowledgments. Yes, absolutely. Like recognizing everyone's contributions,
Right.
no matter how big or small.
Exactly. And he uses this, I think it's called like pulling rank case study.
Pulling rank, yes.
And it's like really shocking.
It is.
Because it's this well-known professor who basically like took ownership of his students' dissertations.
Wow.
If they didn't publish them quickly enough.
Wow.
It's just like such a stark example of how power dynamics can lead to like really unethical practices.
Absolutely.
And it makes you realize that like ethical research isn't just about like following the rules.
Yes.
It's about creating this culture of respect.
Yes.
Right? Like respect for the participants, respect for the data.
Yes.
Respect for everyone involved in the research process.
And it's not as simple as it used to be.
Right.
You know, back in the day, it was like, did you copy and paste this or not?
Yeah.
Right.
But Dr. Zane talks about all these different ways that plagiarism can actually manifest.
It can be really sneaky.
It can be really sneaky.
Right. Yeah.
So it's not just about like directly copying and pasting someone's words.
Right.
You could use their research procedures without permission.
Oh, interesting.
Even if you cite them.
Okay.
Right? Or you could try to like pass off your old data as new data.
Sneaky.
Right. And so it's really important to understand that like that ethical obligation to give credit, it doesn't diminish over time.
Interesting.
He gives this example of a long time ago.
Okay.
Where this student replicates this study that's like decades old, and they don't feel the need to acknowledge the original researcher.
Right. So even if it's considered like common knowledge or it's been around for years and years, you still have to like cite your sources.
Absolutely. You have to acknowledge that foundation upon which that knowledge is built.
Okay, that makes sense. And failing to do so, it's a disservice to the entire field.
Right. Absolutely.
You know? And then finally, let's talk about like the bread and butter of research, which is the data itself.
The data, yes.
That data.
Right.
Dr. Zane really stresses the ethical handling of data.
Okay, so from like how it's stored to how long it's kept.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. It's about ensuring data integrity.
Okay.
Protecting those participants' privacy, you know, secure storage, appropriate retention periods, accurate recording.
Yeah, it's all connected.
All of that is crucial.
Right, and it prevents those like data gone scenarios.
Yes.
Right, where the researcher thinks, oh, I'm done with this, and they like hit delete.
Right.
It's like, wait a minute. We might need that data down the road.
Exactly. And you might not even realize it. Right.
Yeah.
Like there might be a need to replicate that study.
Right.
Or reanalyze the data with, you know, new and improved techniques.
Right. Totally.
Or even just to verify those original findings.
Right. It's about accountability and transparency.
It is.
Throughout that entire research process.
Throughout.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here, right?
We have.
Like multiple layers of responsibility, protecting participants, informed consent, confidentiality, researcher competence, conflicts of interest, plagiarism, data handling.
That's a lot.
It's a lot to think about.
It is.
So, like, what's the key takeaway for listeners? Like, what do we really want them to walk away with?
You know, if I had to pick one thing, I think the biggest takeaway is just that ethical considerations, they aren't just like an afterthought in research. You know, they're not something you just kind of tack on at the end.
Right.
It's like they're woven into every single step of the process.
Yeah, it's like you're not just like running a study.
Right.
It's like you're navigating this whole web of ethical responsibilities, right?
Exactly.
From the participants to the data, to like the field itself, you know?
Absolutely. And I think even if, you know, someone listening, they're not a researcher themselves.
Right.
Just being aware of all these different ethical dimensions, it makes you a more informed consumer of research too, right?
That's a really good point.
Yeah.
So it's like next time I'm reading a study, I should be thinking not just about like, oh, these are the findings, but also...
Right. How did they get those findings?
How did they get those findings?
Yes, exactly.
Like, were ethical guidelines followed? Like, are there any red flags here?
Exactly.
That's such a good point.
And asking those questions, it helps all of us, right?
It does.
To kind of contribute to this more ethical research landscape.
Yes. Because good research. It's not just about, like, you know, making these groundbreaking discoveries.
Right.
It's about making sure that those discoveries were obtained.
Yes.
With integrity.
Absolutely.
And respect for everyone involved.
I couldn't agree more.
Well, Dr. Zane's chapter definitely gave us a lot to think about.
It did. Really interesting stuff.
It really did. A huge thank you to Dr. Zane for his work and to all of you for joining us on this deep dive.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Until next time, everyone, keep asking those tough questions and keep diving deep into the world around you.